Good morning. Thanks for viewing this presentation. My name is Dale Ralston. I have worked in groundwater studies in Idaho since, heaven forbid, 1967. Initially with the Idaho Department of Water Resources, and now the Department of Water Resources, and then for what is now called the Idaho Geological Survey, and then 25 years as a professor of hydrogeology, groundwater studies at the University of Idaho. And then for the last 14 years as an independent one-man engineering firm, mainly working in Idaho, but also Eastern Washington. But all that time has been in groundwater. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide my view of an evaluation of minimum seal requirements in wells. So if we could go to the first slide, that's great, thank you. So the initial question then is, why worry about a surface seal in a well? As groundwater systems in Idaho, obviously you have to drill down to tens of feet to hundreds of feet to get water, and generally in almost all cases you penetrate low permeability materials that don't easily transmit water. These layers provide natural protection for the aquifer from contamination starting at land surface or near land surface. And many of the areas where we're drilling wells, there is contamination. So the well needs to be sealed, particularly on the outside of the casing, to prevent surface water or near surface water from migrating down the outside of the casing and into the aquifer and contaminating the aquifer. Does the well seal provide protection for groundwater contamination? The answer is yes. To be effective, though, that seal needs to go down into a low permeability layer or a low hydraulic conductivity layer. Let's say, for example, you're drilling in an area where there's sand and gravel down to 20 feet, and then there's a thick clay layer, and then there's an aquifer at 100 feet. The seal should then go into that clay layer far enough to prevent poor quality water from the upper aquifer migrating down into the lower aquifer via the well. So the seal should be based upon geology. A properly installed seal, though, then prevents that well from being an avenue for downward movement of contaminated water from near surface. The current minimum requirement is 38 feet, and that provides protection in most, but not all areas. So what are the alternative approaches for well seal requirements? One alternative is to have the driller select the seal based upon area geology and assume some responsibility for potential contamination problems. And as you can imagine, we have a whole range of drillers, and most of them, I think, would not like to have this placed on their shoulder. The second alternative is to have Idaho Department of Water Resources provide the required seal depth for each new well. In other words, the driller would call up and request a start card, or maybe the owner would request a permit, and there would be a lag time between the department saying, well, let's see, you're 2 miles east of Parma, what should the seal depth be in that area? Neither of these approaches are very workable. The selected approach has been a state-wide requirement with a potential for waivers to accommodate site-specific conditions. So what's the history of minimum seal depth requirements within Idaho? The standards were initially established in 1970 that included a seal to a minimum of 18 feet. Interestingly enough, that was one of my job assignments when I was working at what was then called the Idaho Department of Water Administration. After a study that started in 2002, the department increased the required depth of surface seal to 38 feet. And that occurred in 2009. Now recognize that public wells are regulated with a minimum seal depth of 58 feet as required by the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. You may wonder why we come up with 18 feet and 38 feet and 58 feet. And well casing comes in 20-foot lengths approximately, and 2 feet of stick up above land surface gives you, 1 stick gives you 18 feet, 2 sticks gives you 38, and 3 sticks gives you 58 feet. Well, questions were raised in the 2013 legislative session about the appropriateness of requiring all new wells outside of the Ralston Prairie Aquifer in northern Idaho to be constructed with a minimum seal depth of 38 feet. So I was asked by IDWR in 2013 to do an independent study with a focus on northern Idaho. So what are the groundwater resources in Idaho? We are blessed as a state to have tremendous water resources, but particularly groundwater resources. In some cases, the aquifers or water-producing zones are rock, and the dominant rock is basalt. The Snake Plain Aquifer in southern Idaho is a great example. The Columbia River basalt covers a large part of northern Idaho and provides municipal and private water supply. Additional aquifers exist in the state, and they range throughout the full range of rock types, from sandstone to limestones to rhyolites to chert to granitic material. Many domestic wells, and the dominant amount of wells drilled in the state are domestic wells, are in areas where major or minor aquifers haven't even been identified. And the well yields typically are small, but this allows folks to have homes in those areas. So this is just a map that generally shows the water wells in Idaho. The red dots indicate public supply wells, excuse me, the green private wells. It's interesting, more than 166,000 well driller reports are on file in the state. 99% of these are for private wells. 75% of these wells have 6-inch casing, and 67% of the wells are less than 200 feet deep. In other words, the dominant wells constructed in Idaho are for domestic uses and are small diameter and relatively shallow. I mentioned that the well can provide the avenue for contamination of an aquifer, from near-surface sources. So the question is, how widespread are the near-surface sources of contamination? Well, we can look at different categories. Certainly one is identified major contaminant sources, such as a specific facility. A second might be land use related contaminant sources, and the most typical one of these is agriculture, covering a broader area, and certainly individual septic disposal systems. And realize, of course, that most of the domestic wells drilled in Idaho are coupled with an individual septic disposal system. This is just a portion of a statewide map taken from the IDQ website that identifies specific sites, and this happens to be in the Coeur d'Alene area, where contamination actions have been taken. And I won't attempt to identify the different colors of flags, but they represent different kinds of actions and contaminant sources. But the point is, it's widespread. There are some common factors dealing with groundwater resources that are important to focus on. And there are 3 I'm going to list. The first is that there are layers of low hydraulic conductivity material or low permeability material overlying most of the aquifers in Idaho. Most of these low permeability or low hydraulic conductivity materials are sedimentary in nature. In other words, they were deposited by stream or particularly by lakes. They're silt and clay dominated. The other thing is the sediments may be weathering of rock in place. And certainly in a granitic environment, a granite environment, granite will weather to a clay. So there can be clay deposits that were not deposited by streams, but simply with weathering in place. Some of the low hydraulic conductivity layers are rock. And so layers of solid rock can also be a major impediment to groundwater, water moving downward vertically to aquifers. And particularly the dense interior of a basalt flow is the dominant factor to isolate surface contamination to groundwater systems in northern Idaho. The two little drawings just show that even in materials that are identified as sand deposits or sand and gravel deposits, that there's micro layering that will make the horizontal movement of water maybe 5 to 10 times easier than vertical movement. And that's shown by the length of the arrows. A second common groundwater factor, the quality of groundwater within most of the areas of the state is excellent, and we're really blessed by that. Now, there are some areas that have natural constituents that are elevated and cause problems, and the dominant ones here are arsenic and to some extent fluoride. These are not caused by contamination of man-made, but they're natural constituents. There are local areas that have been impacted by land uses, such as elevated nitrate areas in agricultural. And then there are specific areas that have been impacted by a single contaminant source. And this may be a leaking underground petroleum storage tank. It could be a mine waste disposal pile. It could be an injection well from ag chemicals. It could be a number of things. The third and final common factor is that wells constructed with inadequate seals have the potential to and currently actually provide an avenue for contaminated water to move from the shallow subsurface, 5 feet below land surface, downward into aquifers that are relied on for drinking water sources. I've worked on sites where this has been the case, and since I generally work on contamination sites from specific sources, some cases, in 2 cases I can think of, monitor wells that were drilled that did not recognize the micro layering in the sediments and actually interconnected an upper aquifer with a lower aquifer by not installing the correct seal, caused contamination of a lower aquifer. But this occurs also on broad scales in just privately constructed wells. I'd like to give you an example, and this happens to be the Camas Prairie of northern Idaho. I realize there's a Camas Prairie in southern Idaho, but those of us who live up north, there's only one Camas Prairie. It's up in the Grangeville Cottonwood area. Idaho Department of Environmental Quality have identified nitrate areas of concern, and these are areas where the nitrate levels are above background. Background may be near 1 milligram per liter or part per million. The maximum contaminant level above which action gets taken is 10 milligrams per liter. The Camas Prairie, a portion of the Camas Prairie area in northern Idaho, that includes about almost 190,000 acres, is a nitrate area of concern, that 52% of the wells have nitrate levels exceeding 5 milligrams per liter. And that suggests and indicates that it's not a natural occurring constituent, it's from some sort of contamination. This figure just shows the large yellow area is the Camas Prairie nitrate area of concern. You can see that there's other smaller areas, nitrate area of concern, Lewiston Orchards area and the Lapway area. But the one we're going to focus on is number 16, the nitrate area of concern. So being a geologist and the engineer, I focus on what is the hydrogeology, the groundwater geology of the area. And the Camas Prairie is underlain by Columbia River basalts, and these are mostly horizontal basalt flows. And they range in thickness from 50 to 250 feet, something like that. The aquifers, or water-producing zones, occur along the contacts between individual flows. The top of the underlying flow and the bottom of the overlying flow. And this is because these zones are fractured, and there's more water-producing capability. The centers of the basalt flows are very dense and have very low hydraulic conductivity or permeability. And they really form a limit to downward vertical movement of water. So what the end result of this kind of hydrogeologic environment is that the wells that are constructed out there, mostly for domestic and municipal use, there's no groundwater irrigation there. The municipal wells have had a history of long-term water level decline. Not in all, but many of the wells. And that's because the recharge is limited, because the recharge from precipitation on land surface, it's difficult to get to the aquifer because of these dense basalt flow interiors. This is just a shot looking north up the Graves Creek Canyon. Cottonwood is in the left center of the left portion of the slide. And what you're looking at are the outcrops of basalt flows. It's kind of a cool picture. And that's Graves Creek, where the road's going up. So the question is, how can nitrate from land surface get into basalt aquifers that are located hundreds of feet below land surface? When I was part of the University of Idaho, we did a study of the potential for downward movement of water with elevated nitrate through the sequence of basalts in the Camas Prairie. We concluded, given the low hydraulic conductivity of the centers of the flows, that the travel time would exceed hundreds of years. In other words, it's not rational to conclude that water would simply move down through the basalt flows from near surface and get into the aquifer. Almost for sure, we have shallow groundwater leaking past surface casing into uncased or cased boreholes. And that leaking water allows an avenue for the very shallow water just below the root zone that has elevated nitrate. So my conclusion is this nitrate area of concern likely would not exist if a proper surface seal had been installed in all of the wells. Okay, remember back that I indicated that in 2009, the Idaho Department of Water Resources made a rule change to change the seal depth from 18 feet to 38 feet. There were a number of activities that occurred in the years preceding 2009 to seek input on this rule change. And that one of the inputs was from the well drilling community within Idaho. And they essentially said it's logical that the well seal depth should be geology controlled. And I agree with that totally, that the seal should extend down into the confining layer, or low hydraulic conductivity layer that overlies the aquifer. So the Idaho Department of Water Resources staff did a review and looked at well driller reports on file from around the state to determine the depth geologically to what they could identify from the geology on the logs of the confining layer. And they compared that to the alternative of an 18-foot surface seal, a 38-foot surface seal, or a 58-foot surface seal. And the whole idea is that if the confining layer is at 25 feet, then an 18-foot seal would not be adequate, and a 38-foot seal would be adequate. So the results of this, they looked at 700 in some wells, 697 wells, I've forgotten. Anyway, the results say a seal to 18 feet would have been effective for 31% of the wells. A seal to 38 feet would have been effective for 65% of the wells, so it's cumulative. And a seal to 58 feet would have been effective for 81% of the wells. Now, I was asked to take a look at what they did and evaluate it, and I did. I looked at about 100 of their 700 wells, 697 wells, and generally agreed with their interpretation of geology. But I also concluded that since some of the focus I was asked to do was on Northern Idaho, and also the idea that maybe a random selection of wells might not work as well as a selection of wells based upon different kinds of geologic environments. I looked at wells in Northern Idaho, and these are wells in the area generally from the big city of Riggins north to the Canadian border. And I looked at 181 wells. And I chose these by going to given townships, like Township 36 North, Range 1 West, and picking one well out of the top two tier sections, a well out of the middle two tier sections, and a well out of the bottom two tier sections. Within those groups of sections, I just picked the well randomly based upon making sure that it had complete information. So I looked at all of them in the same manner that the Department of Water Resources did. Based on the available geology, I judged whether an 18-foot seal, a 38-foot, or a 58-foot seal. And about 50% of the wells that I looked at and encountered the first confining layer within 18 feet. So I'm saying about 50% of the wells that I looked at, an 18-foot seal would be fine. About 40% of the wells encountered the first confining layer between 18 feet and 38 feet. So again, I'm saying about 40% of the wells should have a 38-foot seal, and about 10% of the wells encountered the first confining layer at a depth greater than 38 feet. So from a geology viewpoint, a seal to 18 feet would have been effective for about 50% of the wells that were included in my study. A seal to 38 feet would have been effective for about 90% of the wells. And my feeling that amount of additional protection going from 18 feet to 38 feet is significant improvement in protecting the water quality of the state, groundwater quality of the state. And certainly I think that this study, my study, supports the decision in 2009 to increase the required seal depth from 18 feet to 38 feet. I also, during my study of well seal depth, looked at what the drillers said, how deep the well seal was installed based upon the information reported by the drillers. And this was interesting because it gives us a sense of, is the drilling community just attempting to meet the minimum or attempting to extend the seal down to what they think is the low permeability zone. These are just statistics, but about 27% of the wells I judged, based upon my analysis, to need an 18-foot seal had an installed seal of 38 feet or better. About 26% of the wells that I judged to need a 38-foot seal had a seal of 38 feet or better. And about 43% of the wells that I judged to need a 58-foot seal had installed seal of 38 feet or better. And what you take from this is a number of the drillers in North Idaho have been sealing to depths greater than the minimum requirement. So going from a minimum of 18 feet to 38 feet does not affect all new wells in the sense that drillers have been going to 38 feet before the regulations require them to do that. One of the questions that have been raised to me in meetings with drillers is the cost. Obviously, it costs more to install a well seal to 38 feet than it does to 18 feet. It's greater drilling of a larger diameter well, casing in the ground, and greater seal material. And so what I asked 4 different drilling firms that do extensive drilling in Northern Idaho to provide cost information relative to the installation of a 38-foot seal versus an 18-foot seal for a 200-foot deep domestic well. And the domestic well, the way it would be constructed is that you would construct a 10-inch diameter hole, generally drilling and driving casing down to the seal depth of either 18 feet or 38 feet, and then go ahead and complete the well with 6-inch diameter casing on down to the full depth of what it is. And then the final step of well construction would be that you would install seal material around the 6-inch casing as you remove the temporary 10-inch casing. And so the question then is, what's the comparison of costs? Well, obviously it costs more to do a seal to 38 feet than to 18 feet. But the question is how much more? And the drillers, 4 different firms, came up with a range of 440 feet additional cost was the minimum, and that was in what the driller termed as a perfect hole where things were great. $440 more to go to 38 feet rather than 18, up to a maximum of $1,080 more to go to 38 feet rather than 18. One of the drillers noted that in his experience, the greater seal depth added about 9% to the cost of the well to the well owner. Certainly there are areas within Idaho where a 38-foot seal is not needed. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? And in a recent drillers meeting with drillers, somebody pointed out that I believe it was in a section of Valley County where the best quality available water resource for domestic wells is on the order of 40 feet down, 35 to 40 to 50 feet down in depth. And so putting in a 38-foot seal in some cases just isolates off the aquifer. And so they have asked for, and I believe received permission to put in shallower seals because of the available depth of the aquifer. This is just a summary of waivers. And waivers, the minimum standards for well construction provide the avenue to have waivers under given circumstances. And so this is information I gained from Department of Water Resources. 2013, there were 2,149 wells drilled in Idaho. There were 28 waiver applications for waivers for sealing requirements, about 1.3% of the wells drilled. And 27 of these waivers were approved. And basically what this does is that for those areas where the drillers and the landowners can identify that a 38-foot seal is not appropriate, IDWR has been flexible in working with the drillers to comply with the rules. So what do I conclude from all of this? The installation of a well seal is a one-time cost that will provide protection for the aquifer for the life of the well. And many of these wells last for decades. Requiring a deeper seal on a new well is a pretty small price to pay to protect our groundwater resource. And that's the water supply source for more than 90% of the people in Idaho. The deeper seal also provides additional protection of the water supply for the well owner. And again, I would mention that most of the wells that are drilled in Idaho were for and are for domestic purposes, and most of them have an adjacent septic disposal system. To be effective, this seal should be installed into the uppermost confining layer that overlies the aquifer. So in some areas that should be 38 feet, in other areas 18 feet is fine, in some areas it should be 70 feet. If you're going to have a statewide standard, the Department of Water Resources felt like a statewide standard of 18 feet was not effective in protecting the resource, and so they went to 38 feet. The statewide study they did, IDWR 2008, and that I did in 2013, shows that a minimum seal depth of 38 feet provides more protection of groundwater quality than does a minimum seal depth of 18 feet, simply because a greater percentage of the wells would have a seal that penetrates the confining layer. I recognize, though, that there needs to be some degree of flexibility from a statewide standard. And so the waiver program, in my opinion, appears to provide that needed avenue to deal with specific areas. And the drilling community that I've chatted with felt like the waiver program was workable. Finally, I believe that the present program administered by IDWR is really a pretty effective balance between protection of groundwater resources of the state and the flexibility for well construction in local areas. I appreciate you viewing this presentation, and my contact information is here, either email or cell phone, and I would be happy to chat with you. Thank you very much.